Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore, and welcome to something new on the Real News. It's going to be a regular panel on Canada. We're going to invite different journalists and commentators to come on and give us a sense of what's important, what's new in Canada, and we're going to discuss and debate the issues. So, first of all, joining us from today in Toronto is Yves Engler. Yves is a Canadian commentator and author. His most recent book is The Ugly Canadians, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy. He previously published The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy and Canada in Haiti, Waging War on the Poor Majority. And now joining us from Vancouver is Linda Solomon-Wood. She's publisher and editor-in-chief of the Vancouver Observer, a national, daily, independent, award-winning news site. Thanks very much for both of you. So Linda, kick us off. What story have you been working on?
Well, one of the biggest stories this week has been about the wall of resistance in British Columbia to pipelines from the tar sands coming to fruition in a way that was kind of stunning when an announcement has been made that pipelines are going to be going east now instead. There's a $12 billion project proposed, Energy East by TransCanada, and it would carry oil to refineries in the east. So it's being viewed as a victory by environmentalists in British Columbia.
Now, do you have what evidence or what indicates that they would have gone west if they could have?
Well, they're still trying to go west. They do have two big pipeline proposals west. One is the Northern Gateway pipeline, which would go through the Rockies out to through the Great Bear Rainforest to western coast of British Columbia. That is being fiercely disputed and fought by First Nations, environmental groups, and just regular citizens who are really worried that increasing pipelines in British Columbia is going to increase oil tanker traffic along the coast and put British Columbia in grave peril of an oil spill.
And that's primarily what's driving it, is the fear of oil spill. I know the fight that's been going on about the pipeline going through the United States has focused a little more on the carbon emissions of tar sands and the kind of oil it is. How much is that driving it, or it's more the local problem of oil spills?
There's been a lot of polling done on this issue, and what they find is that most people really don't care about pipes. The issue isn't about a pipeline. The issue is about what those pipes are going to bring and about the oil tanker traffic. People are very passionate about the natural beauty and the environment in British Columbia and really don't want to see it destroyed.
And the native groups, native tribes and native leaders have been playing a leading role in this?
Absolutely. They have been waging court battles against it, and they have been out in the streets. And Art Sterrett, who is a very prominent Coastal First Nations leader, is saying that people are coming to him and just asking, what do I do? Where do I go to stand in front of the, trucks that are going to be, or the workers? How do I stop this thing from happening? This is really a deep issue for First Nations in British Columbia. This threatens their livelihood. This threatens their way of life.
And Yves, the pipelines that are planned now, or they're talking about, are going to go east, I think, to St. John, and maybe some refineries along the way. I mean, do you think there's going to be similar opposition on the East Coast, or is this something specific about British Columbia?
Well, we just saw a couple of days ago that the National Energy Board okayed the reversal of the Line 9 pipeline, which was previously going, taking oil from east to west and reversing it to west to east, which is going to lead to bringing tar sands oil, bitumen to Montreal refineries. There's been opposition to the pipeline. The National Energy Board didn't take serious consideration to that opposition, which is not a particularly big surprise since we know the orientation of the Harper government. So there is resistance. There's lots of opposition. Here in Toronto, there's activist groups that have already come out and said they're going to engage in civil disobedience to block the effort. It's a little bit more difficult than the Northern Gateway because it is a pipeline that already exists. It's just a question of reversing. The Energy East pipeline is a big, even bigger project. The Line 9 is about, I think, 300,000 barrels of oil a day is what they want to have it at its peak, which is a bit of an increase from the current flow. The Energy East is, of course, a much bigger project. There is resistance. There's growing understanding of climate disturbances. There's obviously concern. The Line 9 goes right through Toronto. Where large bodies of large numbers of people live. So there's concern from a sort of direct, if there's a leak, what impact, even in the case of the TTC, the Toronto subway, the impact that in some stations are basically right next to the pipeline. So there's that concern. I think there's also the bigger concern about climate emissions and the toll this has on the humanities
Right.
going forward. But it's contested. But the where this goes, the political establishment is almost entirely supportive. You have in Quebec, which is a Parti Québécois government, which is supposed to be somewhat environmentally minded, a more sort of social democratic government. They were quite supportive of Line 9. They've even been supportive of Energy East. So the official political world is very much in support of tar sands development. And
Linda, one of the reasons the Aboriginal peoples in British Columbia seem to have some real leverage here and I guess the part of the question is, so much of the land claims are unsettled in British Columbia that pipeline companies, I guess, don't know who's going to wind up really having the rights to say who can have a pipeline and who can't. And is that also what's scaring them off?
Yes, and the treaty, First Nations treaty rights in Canada are much stronger than in the United States. And as a result of that, well, unfortunately for the Harper government, they really didn't handle consultation with First Nations very well. In fact, rather than consultation, it's been almost as if they've gone on the attack against First Nations, as well as really anybody who has been dissenting against, really against the pipeline projects. They have marginalized people for just disagreeing with the idea and gone on the attack against charitable groups such as David Suzuki Foundation for opposing them. So the Harper government has just appointed Jim Prentice, who has had strong ties with First Nation groups, to try to recover the process some.
Right. Okay, let's switch to another story. Yves, you just mentioned the Parti Québécois in Quebec, now the provincial government, is supposed to be sort of a social democratic left of center government, but one of the richest, most powerful corporate leaders in Quebec is going to run for them. So what's that story?
Yeah, the election was just announced for early April. And there's been a minority government in Quebec. So the Parti Québécois, which has had the minority government, announced election, and a couple of days into the campaign, announced what's considered a star candidate, which is Pierre Karl Péladeau, who is one of the richest Quebecers. He's the owner of the biggest media conglomerate in the province. This is a big story because by running for the PQ, he has publicly come out as a sovereigntist, so in support of Quebec nationhood, or of Quebec as its own country, which is obviously there's a big conversation about that in English Canada. He's also the owner of some of the most right-wing, the Sun Media Network in English Canada, which has been dubbed Fox in their cable channel, has been dubbed Fox News North, as well as a whole chain of newspapers. So there's a whole question about the sovereigntist question from the standpoint of the Parti Québécois, which has traditionally been close to unions. Pierre Karl Péladeau, he's been considered to be a serious anti-union, a person who has locked out employees at two of his newspapers for 2 years in one instance. He's considered to be 14 different lockouts, so I think over the past 10 years or something like that his companies have pursued. So it's a very controversial move with those that are more social democratic minded. It's considered a big boost to the sovereigntist movement, because he is one of the richest people in the province, and to come out in favor of sovereignty. Traditionally, the business class has not been particularly sympathetic to the sovereigntist movement. So it's having lots of dynamic. It's an example of just the sort of rightward shift, as I was kind of alluding to, of the Parti Québécois government. This is the government, Pauline Marois, who before the election, she was actually even on the street with some of the student demonstrators 2 years ago in the big student strike that took place in Quebec. She was, banging pots and pans in support of the movement. So it's a step in a interesting direction, in a rightward direction. It's also it's tied into or it's part with this whole rise of this values charter, which is seen as very xenophobic move by the Parti Québécois government, and really a sort of an attack against Muslims in Quebec, and sort of playing off fear of immigrants that's somewhat tied into
Yves, I understand he takes that as a position, but if PQ wins again, do you think there's going to be another referendum?
There's a roadmap towards a referendum question, possibly around more powers to Quebec with regards to culture and education and the like. Not a straight "do you want to secede from Canada" question. And the idea is that if the majority would vote for giving greater powers to Quebec, then the PQ government with a majority would go back to the federal government, ask for those powers. The federal government would likely say no, or possibly say no, and then the PQ government would go back to the population and say, okay, we asked for more rights over language and education and the like. The federal government wouldn't give us this, and now we need to have a referendum on independence, or depending on exactly how the question would be worded. So yes, I think there's a substantive amount of the population in Quebec that's supportive of the sovereigntist movement. The Harper government is very much disliked in Quebec, so its ability to sort of push back against a PQ government pushing for sovereignty would be very minimal, and would probably actually just contribute to support for the sovereigntist movement. But yeah, it's in 1995 the vote was less than 1% difference that the no won. So
but that was a PQ that had very left-looking pretensions. With the Péladeau, it doesn't quite look so left.
No, for sure, it doesn't look so left. But interestingly enough, there's also two candidates from the more rightward element of the student movement. There's two PQ candidates for the election that are from the former student leaders, not the more radical Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, who was really the main spokesperson of the student movement. But two others are part of the PQ. So it's a complicated party, but there's increasingly Péladeau's joining the PQ is a sign of more and more of the business class not seeing sovereignty as a threat. Basically, it comes down to we'll continue with capitalism as is, but we have a bit more national rights, a bit more linguistic rights, which I think a significant proportion of the Quebec business class would be more or less sympathetic towards. So I think it's certainly I wouldn't exclude it from being a possibility of a referendum that was.
Okay, well, we'll do more on this as we get closer to an election. So thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.